I came home early to surprise my wife, only to find 3 strangers had beaten me to it. What started as the worst night of my life turned into a chain of events I never saw coming, and by the end I wasn't the one left broken. Bob's world shattered the day he uncovered his wife's betrayal, setting off a series of unexpected events that would forever alter his path. In his search for understanding, healing, and perhaps even forgiveness, he found himself crossing paths with his ex-wife, Sue, and her new partner, Peter. What started as a chance encounter in a diner soon unearthed buried secrets, offering new perspectives and stirring emotions he thought he had long buried. As I scanned the restaurant for my scheduled meeting, my gaze landed on a familiar face, Susan, my former wife. Seated next to her was a middle-aged man, slightly overweight, his once athletic build softened by years of indulgence. Peter, I recalled his name. Though time had changed him, Susan remained radiant, effortlessly captivating. He spoke loudly, boasting about his wealth, oblivious to the way my presence had stirred a flood of memories within me. 3 years had passed since our divorce, yet the emotions resurfaced as if no time had passed at all. I took a step back, momentarily disoriented. She was here by coincidence, not by intention, yet seeing her in this very place, where I was supposed to meet someone else, felt like a cruel twist of fate. But perhaps it was fitting. After all, her wishes had been fulfilled, while I was still wrestling with the scars she left behind. It all began the night I had to travel to Albany for a business meeting. I had planned to stay overnight, avoiding the exhaustion of a late drive home. An hour into my journey, my client called, informing me that he had suffered a minor injury and needed to reschedule. He assured me he was fine, but with the meeting postponed, I found myself reconsidering my plans. Rather than waste another 2 hours driving aimlessly, I turned back, eager to surprise my wife with a romantic dinner. As I approached our home, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. 3 unfamiliar vehicles lined our driveway, a sight that immediately raised my suspicions. Still, I pushed aside my doubts, clinging to the hope that there was a reasonable explanation. But the moment I stepped inside, all illusions of trust crumbled. Scattered across the living room floor were 4 sets of men's clothing, crumpled, discarded. A knot formed in my stomach as I heard a sound from upstairs. My wife's voice. But not in distress. No, the tone was something else entirely. My chest tightened as I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The moment I reached our bedroom door, the final thread of hope snapped. Peering inside, I saw her. My wife. But she was not alone. 3 men surrounded her, one of whom I instantly recognized, her boss, Jeff Davis. They weren't treating her as a person but as entertainment, nothing more than a source of their amusement. A wave of nausea hit me, but I forced myself to act. I pulled out my phone, capturing as much as I could, 5, maybe 10 minutes of footage. It was all I could stomach. Some might have found the scene exhilarating, but for me it was pure agony. Shaken, I stumbled downstairs, struggling to steady my breath. My mind raced, my emotions a storm of anger, humiliation, and heartbreak. I needed a moment to regain control, to think rationally. Stepping into my office, I reached for my safe, opening it with trembling hands. My fingers brushed against cold steel as I retrieved my firearm. I wasn't a violent man. I never had been. But in that moment, as I disengaged the safety, I knew one thing for certain. If this went any further, if they dared push past a line I could not tolerate, I wouldn't hesitate to act. I moved quickly, gathering all the car keys and wallets from the discarded trousers strewn across my living room. Once outside, I methodically deflated the tires of every vehicle in the driveway, including Susan's. A small, satisfied smirk tugged at the corners of my mouth. If the Grinch himself had been watching, he would have nodded in approval. Now it was time for the next phase. I had seen Susan's phone on the nightstand while recording, and I knew she would be expecting my usual check-in around this time. Perfect. Slipping into a concealed spot behind the staircase, I set up my camera and dialed her number. Rang. And rang. Straight to voicemail. I redialed. Every 2 minutes. I knew she would eventually cave and pick up. The silence in the house stretched on, so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat drumming in my ears. Then finally she answered. Hey Bobby. How's Alan? She asked, breathless. In the background I could hear muffled laughter, hurried movements. They were trying to stay quiet. You sound out of breath. Everything okay? I asked, masking my fury with faux concern. Oh. I just ran upstairs to grab my phone, she quickly lied, her voice laced with nerves. My meeting got cancelled, so I'm heading home now, I said smoothly. How about we go out for dinner tonight? The pause was slight, but I caught it, the split second where anxiety took over. "You're coming back now?" she echoed, the strain in her voice evident. "Yes. Sounds good." There was a rustling on her end. "Of course. That sounds wonderful. I'll just get ready, darling. See you soon," she blurted out before hastily disconnecting the call. I grinned. Showtime. Mere minutes later, I watched as 4 fully unclothed individuals scurried down my staircase, scrambling to gather their clothes like roaches scattering from the light. They dressed in a hurry, pulling on shirts inside out, fumbling with belts, avoiding each other's eyes. Susan, too, smoothed out her attire, shaking slightly as she buttoned her blouse. They all rushed toward the door at once, the men filing out together while Susan threw on a coat and shoes. But she hesitated. Peeking outside, she anxiously scanned the street, waiting for them to leave before stepping out herself. If she hadn't been so consumed by panic, she might have noticed my car parked just a few yards away. That hesitation cost her. Just as she stepped onto the porch to hear the last frantic calls from her so-called guests, I moved. Without a word, I swung the door shut and locked it. The click of the deadbolt was deafening. Susan spun around just in time to see me through the glass. Her eyes widened in disbelief. She lunged for the door, pressing her hands against the window. "Bob. Wait. Let's talk," she pleaded, her voice laced with desperation. But I was done listening. "The time for conversation is over," I said calmly, staring at her through the glass before turning away. A moment later, the men realized what had happened. Panicked and humiliated, they hurried back onto my porch, pounding their fists against the door. And just like that, the night had only just begun. It didn't take long for them to realize their wallets and keys were missing. Their frantic glances toward the house made it obvious. But before they could start demanding them, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "There are intruders attempting to break into my home," I reported calmly. The dispatcher didn't seem surprised. Apparently, one of my neighbors had already called. I provided my name and address, then hung up, stepping back inside to wait. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street. A police car pulled up and 2 officers stepped out. They first approached Susan, questioning her while I remained inside. When I finally stepped out onto the porch, I looked the officers straight in the eye and said, "Officers, these men assaulted my wife. I want them arrested." That single sentence sent the entire group into chaos. "What? That's a lie," one of the men protested. "She invited us here," another added, his face turning red. Everyone, including me, turned to Susan. She stood frozen, eyes darting between me and the officers, her face pale under the porch light. "Susan?" one officer prompted. Her gaze dropped to the ground. In a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, she admitted, "I invited them over. It was consensual." Relief washed over the men's faces. No assault charges. A few minutes later, 2 more police cars arrived at my request. The officers took statements, recording everyone's details for their report. When they were done, the lead officer approached me. "Sir, since your wife willingly invited them here and they're all adults, there's not much we can do," he explained. "I'd suggest seeking counseling if you too." "Counseling?" I cut him off. "That won't be necessary." I turned to one of the officers. "I'd like a taxi called for Mrs. Thomas. She won't be staying here tonight." One of the men begrudgingly arranged for a cab, only to realize their cars were useless with all 4 tires slashed. Their frustration grew when they discovered their wallets and keys were missing. "You took our stuff," one of them accused, pointing at me. I raised an eyebrow. "Did I?" I said flatly. With no evidence, they had no choice but to drop it. As I turned back toward the house, Susan finally worked up the nerve to approach me. A daring move, given my fury and the fact that I was still armed. "Bobby. I'm truly sorry," she started, her voice shaking. I cut her off before she could continue. "I don't want your apology, Susan." My voice was cold, distant. "From now on you are nothing to me. I won't even refer to you by name anymore. Any future communication will go through Ted." And with that, I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. Through the window, I saw Susan retreat back to the group, tears streaming down her face. Jeff tried to console her, but she pushed him away. That, at least, brought me some satisfaction. But it didn't last long. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, the reality of what had happened came crashing down. The room still bore the evidence of their betrayal. The sheets, the scent, the mere presence of what had taken place. Rage surged through me. Without thinking, I grabbed the mattress and hurled it out the window, watching it crash onto the lawn below. My anger wasn't satisfied. I stormed into the garage, grabbed my toolbox and returned with one goal: destruction. I dismantled the bed, piece by piece, throwing every last fragment onto the lawn until nothing remained but an empty space. By the time I was done, I stood in the wreckage of what used to be my bedroom, chest heaving, hands shaking. And for the first time that night, the silence felt deafening. Back in the bedroom, my eyes landed on Susan's phone, still lying on the floor from the chaos earlier. I picked it up, my grip tightening as I unlocked it and scrolled through her messages and emails. And there it was. Explicit photos. Lewd conversations. Even short video clips featuring men I had never seen before. But from the images, it was clear that Susan knew them all too well. My stomach churned, yet there was no sadness, only a hollow, exhausted realization that the woman I once cherished had been living a double life right under my nose. I needed to get her out of my home. Grabbing a handful of trash bags, I started packing up her clothes. The act felt almost absurd, and despite everything, I found myself chuckling. Just days ago, this was the woman I had been devoted to. Now, that devotion was a distant memory. One by one, I dragged every box and suitcase from our bedroom down to the ground floor, sorting them into separate piles in the front yard. Then I turned to the guest room, her space for when she needed time to herself. I soon realized there was more to uncover. Hauling out her extra belongings, I opened the dresser drawers, clearing them one by one. But the last drawer wouldn't budge. Frustrated and running on pure adrenaline, I yanked it hard until something inside snapped. With a final pull, the drawer slid free, revealing the hidden stash inside. My blood ran cold. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at: discs, old videotapes, and printouts. But when I flipped through them, reality hit like a sledgehammer. Photos of Susan. At work. In the conference room. But she wasn't alone. Jeff, her manager. And Bill Evans, his boss. A man well known in our community, frequently appearing in the news, shaking hands at charity events, and making speeches about integrity and leadership. And here he was, taking advantage of my wife. A deep, sickening hopelessness settled over me. Not because I still loved her, but because I finally understood the full extent of her betrayal. This wasn't just an affair. It was a lifestyle. I clenched my jaw and grabbed a large envelope, placing inside a CD-ROM and the footage I had recorded earlier that night. There was only one person I trusted to handle this properly: Tedworth, my closest friend and attorney. If Susan thought she could simply walk away from this without consequences, she was sorely mistaken. As I sealed the envelope, I noticed one final email, one she had sent to her friend, Sarah. My curiosity got the best of me and I read, "I don't want anything to do with him now. Bobby is as faithful as he is naive. I really think it's just a matter of time until he discovers my secret way of living. He's not totally clueless, love just makes him blind. Honestly, he's even put on some weight lately, and when I compare him to the men I know, it's hard to feel attracted to him anymore." I exhaled sharply, the last ounce of restraint draining from me. Susan had not only betrayed me, she had mocked me, ridiculed me. The woman I had built a life with had spent years laughing at my trust, knowing that one day, it would all come crashing down. And today was that day. With renewed purpose, I stepped outside, holding the envelope tight. It was time to end this chapter once and for all. I'm not a fan of beards, and as long as financial stability is secured, I find it surprisingly easy to get what I want. Alas, Bobby's sudden return means I have to cut this short. Looking forward to seeing you on Tuesday, do call. I reread the message, each word cutting deeper than the last. The casual tone, the indifference, the way she dismissed our years together like they meant nothing, it wounded me more than I could put into words. Had I really been so blind? Had my love for her made me overlook years of betrayal? The weight of it all pressed down on me and I sank onto the couch, staring at nothing. Sleep eventually took over, though it wasn't peaceful. Morning came, and with it, the reality of what had happened. As I stepped outside, the neighbor across the street cast me a puzzled look. No doubt, the gossip was already spreading. The joys of suburban life. Whispers behind closed doors, speculation over coffee. Ignoring it, I headed downtown for breakfast before making my way to Ted's office. Inside, Mary, Ted's longtime assistant, greeted me with a warm smile and a steaming cup of coffee, cream, no sugar, just the way I liked it. "Holy hell, Bobby," she said, shaking her head. "I don't know what your beef with Ted is, but when I mentioned your name, he told me to clear his entire schedule. Said he could use a month off after today." She chuckled, attempting to lighten the mood. I gave a small smile but said nothing. She handed me my coffee, then leaned in slightly. "By the way, if you're wondering who Tammy Brown is, you'll have to ask Sue. But after what you saw in those emails and videos, I don't see why you'd even bother." I took a slow sip, exhaling through my nose. "I don't just want a divorce, Mary. I want to take serious action. I won't just disappear quietly. Okay, she nodded. But first, lawsuits. Tony at the Ace Tennis Club is at the top of the list. We can't go after Sarah, she's just a close friend of Sue, and that won't hold up in court. But Sue's business? That's fair game. I listened intently as she continued. We're also targeting those 2 clients who were in your house. Them and their firms. And of course, Jeff Davis, Bill Evans and their entire operation. Ted's voice cut in from his office doorway. For now, let's focus on getting you out of this marriage and securing your assets. Everything else we'll handle step by step. He paused, then smirked slightly. That being said, maybe you'd like to join me for dinner later. Change of scenery might do you good. I nodded but was already pulling out my phone. I need to set up a meeting with Bill Evans. 2 o'clock. Not long after, Mary peeked into Ted's office. You have a call, she announced. Mary, Ted sighed, rubbing his temples. I said no calls. I know, she replied, glancing at me before lowering her voice. It's Susan. Ted exhaled sharply, glancing at me for confirmation. I didn't say a word. He turned back to Mary. Apologies, but today's going to be a long one. And it's only just begun. She nodded, stepping away. As she left, I heard him mutter under his breath. Does she know Bobby is here? A few seconds later, the phone clicked as Ted picked up. Susan, he said, his tone professional but cold. I didn't need to hear the other side of the conversation to know what she was saying. Apologies, excuses, perhaps even crocodile tears. Ted listened for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. You want a word with him? He glanced at me again, raising an eyebrow. Then his voice hardened. Susan, you devastated a man who was nothing but loyal to you. I doubt he values your opinion now. My best advice? Find yourself a good attorney. You're going to need one. He placed the phone back on the receiver without another word. Turning to me, he sighed. Bill Evans is scheduled for 1:40. Let's get to work. I strongly advise against attending, Susan. Hear me out. Ted's voice was firm but measured. If you so much as step foot near this office to eavesdrop, I'll tell Bobby to walk out and I guarantee things will get messy. Your best option right now is to be patient and composed. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. I know where he put your belongings, Susan. And honestly, the mere thought of him facing you right now is enough to make his blood boil. So don't push it. Stay with Sarah and we'll handle things through the proper channels. Once you've secured an attorney, have them reach out to me. That's the only way this moves forward. Pause. Then Ted's tone shifted, colder now. And don't think for a second that your tears will change anything. They may have worked on Bobby before, but they won't work on me. I'm not just his legal counsel, I'm his friend. If I need to be firm, I will be. And this situation certainly calls for it. He leaned back in his chair. I've always respected you, Susan. Even liked you. Until today. Unfortunately, you're about to see a side of me I usually reserve for adversaries. I watched as he ended the call without another word. Ted turned to me and sighed. Before our 2 p.m. meeting, I suggest you avoid watching those videos again. No need to fuel your frustration right before we sit down with them. He had a point. No good would come from reopening that wound right now. I nodded in agreement. Thanks, Ted, I said sincerely. Stepping out into the hallway, I spotted Mary, who raised an eyebrow. Well? She asked expectantly. I gave her a slight smile. Let's just say things are moving forward. She grinned. Good. Now, since this is shaping up to be a stressful day, I say we balance it out by making Ted treat us to a ridiculously expensive dinner later. Ted groaned from his office. I can hear you, Mary. We laughed, the tension breaking for a moment as we stepped out of the building. Lunch with Mary turned out to be a surprisingly pleasant distraction. She had a way of steering conversations away from heavy topics, making me forget, even briefly, the storm that was still brewing. But the moment we returned to Ted's office, reality came rushing back. Look at this, Ted said, turning his laptop screen toward me. On the screen was a grainy image of an elderly man wrapped in a towel. Long gray hair, thick mustache, someone I didn't recognize. Ted, I have no idea who that is, I admitted. But judging by your expression, you do. Ted leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Bobby, this guy is directly connected to our meeting at the tennis club today. 4 o'clock, he revealed. And trust me, this is going to be interesting. Despite everything, I found myself smirking. Besides being a damn good lawyer, Ted was also someone I could genuinely count on. In the middle of this disaster, I was grateful to have him in my corner. We gathered our things and prepared to leave for our 2 p.m. meeting. As we arrived, Bill Evans greeted me with his usual smug demeanor, clearly expecting to take control of the conversation. "Just between us," he started, lowering his voice. "I assumed this would be a private discussion." I didn't flinch. "Anything you have to say to me you can say in front of Ted," I replied coolly, making it clear that there would be no backroom deals or whispered manipulation. Ted shot me an approving glance. Bill exhaled slowly, realizing this wasn't going to go the way he had planned. And with that we took our seats. I had no interest in small talk or negotiation, and Bill Evans quickly picked up on that. Realizing he wouldn't be able to manipulate the situation, he reluctantly acknowledged Ted's presence and directed his words solely at me, completely disregarding Ted. That, of course, only amused Ted, who sat back with a knowing smirk, already anticipating what was about to unfold. I let Bill speak first, giving him just enough rope before we pulled the rug out from under him. "Bob, may I call you Bob?" he asked, attempting a friendly, disarming approach. "No issue whatsoever," I replied smoothly. "Actually, I thought it'd be fitting given the circumstances." Ted chuckled under his breath. "Oh, you have no idea how fitting." Bill frowned, sensing something was off. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his irritation barely concealed. Ted leaned forward, his expression neutral but his voice laced with amusement. "Allow me to demonstrate. As they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words." With that, he placed a portable DVD player on Bill's desk and handed a stack of still images from the video to Jeff, not Bill. Jeff's face drained of color the moment he glanced at them. His hands trembled as he hesitated before reluctantly passing the pictures to Bill. Bill took the images and stared, his expression frozen as he processed what he was looking at. Himself and Jeff, unmistakably engaged in compromising acts with my wife. Silence hung in the air. Then, as if needing further confirmation, Ted rotated Bill's computer monitor, pressing play on the video. The footage left no room for doubt. It showed, from multiple angles, Bill and Jeff repeatedly using my wife in their boardroom. Bill's face darkened as the reality of the situation hit him. His mind was clearly racing, scrambling to figure out damage control. I watched as he mentally calculated the risks, the impact on his company, his public image, his family, and most of all, his finances. I could see it in his eyes. He knew his downfall was imminent. Ted took full advantage of the moment. "Jeff," he said, turning toward him, "once these men leave, you and I are going to have a very serious discussion about your future." Jeff gulped, looking as though he wanted to say something, but a glance at Bill kept him quiet. As we wrapped up the meeting, I noticed Ted motioning subtly for me to hold my questions until we were outside. I wasn't sure why, but I trusted him. Unbeknownst to me, Susan was nearby, listening in on everything from the hallway. But Ted noticed. Before we could step out, the intercom buzzed and Bill's assistant's voice filled the room. "Mr. Evans, should I send in Mrs. Thomas now?" A slow grin spread across my face. Bill was about to have the most uncomfortable meeting of his life. Outside the office. Once we were in the clear, I turned to Ted, unable to hold back my curiosity. "Why did you give Jeff an escape route back there?" I asked. Ted smirked. "Jeff's a rat, but he's a useful rat. There are bigger fish to fry." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to elaborate. "There's a law firm that has represented Evans in another case," Ted continued. "They're highly competent, but the lead attorney is also a pragmatist. I'll reach out to him tomorrow and make it clear. If they think they can brush this under the rug with some weak settlement, it could have catastrophic consequences for their client's business and personal life." "And what's your offer?" I asked, intrigued. "I'll propose they settle for around $3 million, or they can take their chances and let everything unravel in court." Ted paused, then shrugged. "If they refuse, well, then we see just how much damage they're willing to risk." I exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling in. Now all I had to do was wait and see if they were smart enough to take the deal. I had the power to drag Susan's name through the mud, and frankly, I had no intention of being kind. With just a few calls, I could have her infidelity plastered all over the local newspaper. And as for my contacts at 3 different news stations, they'd jump at the chance to air some carefully edited footage or blurt out stills from the recordings. Ted leaned back in his chair, listening carefully. "You've always had my back and I trust your judgment," I admitted. "I just wish none of this had happened in the first place. Looking back, I think I preferred being an oblivious husband over being publicly humiliated by an unfaithful wife." Ted studied me for a moment before nodding. "You still have my permission to handle this however you see fit," I added. Just then the door opened and Harry Real walked in, his expression unreadable. He wasted no time with pleasantries. "All right," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. You called this meeting, so let's get on with it. I want this resolved as quickly as possible. Ted remained composed, gesturing toward me. Mr. Real, this is Bob Thomas, he introduced. His wife is a member of your club. We've recently come across information confirming that your tennis coach, Tony Simba, was engaged in an inappropriate relationship with Mrs. Thomas. Real's expression remained neutral, but I could see the gears turning in his mind. He wasn't just processing the accusation, he was already considering the implications for his business. Ted didn't give him time to formulate an excuse. Harry, let's be clear, you were aware of what was happening, Ted continued, his voice calm but firm. One of your employees took advantage of a paying club member's wife. A woman whose membership fees, I might add, were covered by her husband. And now that husband is a very unhappy customer. Real exhaled slowly, clearly weighing his options. This isn't ideal, he admitted, but I can't argue with your logic. I'll reach out tomorrow with my offer. If we come to an agreement, I want all recordings returned to me, no copies, no leaks. He hesitated, then added, and I'll fire Tony immediately. Ted smirked, satisfied. That's all we needed to hear. Real leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. You know, this feels an awful lot like extortion. Ted simply smiled as he switched off the DVD player and stood. Oh, and do say hello to Tito Martinez for me. Go to hell, Real muttered. Ted just chuckled as we exited the office. As we walked back to the car, I exhaled, finally allowing myself to process everything. I always knew there was some shady stuff happening at that club, I admitted, but I didn't realize how deep it went. People like Harry always protect their own until it's bad for business, Ted replied. He'll settle. He just doesn't like being backed into a corner. I nodded, knowing he was right. Looking back, I had given Susan everything she wanted. A house, a car, financial stability. Yet, despite all of it, she betrayed me in ways I could never have imagined. The only silver lining? There were no children involved, which meant I owed her nothing beyond the divorce settlement. Our interactions after that were limited. We saw each other only twice in court, and both times, I made sure my words cut deep enough to bring her to tears. And you know what? That part at least felt good. I often wonder why she cried then, during those final moments in court, but not when she was tearing my life apart. Not when she was orchestrating the most painful period I had ever endured. Despite everything, I came out of it better than before. Wealthier, yes, but that wasn't the real victory. I had rebuilt myself. The life I had once known, with its routine, its familiar comforts, was gone, but in its place I had something new. Something stronger. My hair was cropped short now, my physique lean from regular workouts. Financial support from Jeff and Bill's settlement had opened doors for me, allowing me to reinvent myself in ways I hadn't thought possible. My wardrobe was sharper, my confidence restored, and I made a point to always present myself well in public. And so, when I saw Susan again, I decided to be the one to initiate the conversation. You look fantastic today, I said smoothly, watching her reaction. Almost forgot how stunning you are. It was deliberate, meant to provoke, to test the waters. I had always known how to press her buttons, and old habits die hard. The man beside her stiffened. He was clearly uncomfortable with my presence. His expression betrayed his disdain before he even spoke. My name is Peter, he said. Sue's fiancé. I smirked, noting his barely concealed irritation. Fiancé? Well then, you must be the new dream come true. His jaw clenched, but he maintained his composure. I'm also her CFO. And frankly, I'd advise against calling her that. His reluctance to escalate things intrigued me. He wanted to stay in control. But I wasn't here to start a fight. I was here to finish something. I just have 3 questions, I said, my voice steady. After that, I'll be out of your lives for good. I could see the curiosity flicker in his eyes. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he wanted to hear it. Ever considered, I continued, that I was once just like you? That I too once believed I was the exception? That I could spare myself the agony? His face darkened slightly, but he said nothing. I assume she painted me as the villain in her story, I added. But people like Susan, they don't change. They follow patterns. The same habits over and over again. She did it to me. She'll do it to you. I could tell he didn't want to believe it. But doubt had been planted. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He hesitated before taking it, curiosity winning out over caution. I had carried that email with me for 3 years, reading it, rereading it, using it as fuel to rebuild myself. Without another word, I placed it in his hand, then turned away. Susan watched me go, but I didn't look back. I wasn't going to sit in that eerie atmosphere any longer. Not with her. Not with him. As I stepped into the entrance hall, I pulled out my phone and called my client. They were running late and suggested rescheduling. Fine by me. Before leaving, I glanced back one last time at their table. Susan had returned, scanning the restaurant for Peter. She sat down, her expression shifting as she spotted the old email in front of her. And beneath it, Peter's note. I didn't stay to see her reaction. Some things don't need a witness.